In this video, we're going to show you how to print out a full-size blank mock-up from the die line that you've created. We recommend doing this as a test on every die line to make sure that number one, it functions correctly and folds up correctly, and number two, that it fits your product and it will work on the stock that you've selected. Materials that we use are fairly simple. We've got an Xacto knife, some kind of a burnisher. If you don't have one of these, any dull-tipped instrument would work. A butter knife, even a paperclip, a folded paperclip sometimes will work. Anything that's rounded that you can emboss down into paper. And a metal-edged straight edge. I know there's plastic triangles and rulers out there, but we don't recommend plastic. As you can see, slip of knives mark it up and they tend to chew up on the edge. So we really recommend using a metal-edged straight edge. And some tape. We've got regular tape, double stick tape. As we've said before in other videos, there are multiple types of stock that you can do your dummy out of. You've probably predetermined which stock might work the best, but as you can see here, there's stocks anywhere from, these are coated stocks, anywhere from 8 point all the way up to 48 point. There are also corrugate stocks of different weights that mock-ups will typically be made out of. Today, on this particular package, since it's fairly small, we've determined that 14 point stock would probably be appropriate for this, that we don't need anything thicker or thinner. So we've pulled out a sheet, trimmed it down to size of 14 point stock. You will have printed your mock-up or your die line on a sheet of paper at 100%. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, just make sure that it's 100% of your size. And we start by taping this on top of our 14 point stock using just regular tape. And this is just to keep things in position as you are trimming your mock-up out. All right, if you can remember from the tutorial, there are different line types on your die line, typically. Folds are generally indicated with a dotted line. Your cut lines should have been indicated by a solid line. And typically this cut line, you have one cut line that'll go all the way around your die line. And then the interior fold lines. What I typically start doing in the beginning is ticking off where the fold lines are going to go. Since I'm not going to be cutting those and I don't want them to shift, I typically take the point of a sharp knife and on all of my dotted lines, I will press the point down into the stock at the start and the end of a score line. And what this will do, if I peel this up, is put a tick mark on your sheet. And after we're done trimming the whole thing out, these will be our guidelines that we'll use to score our folds. So I just basically follow all the way through the die line and tick off all of my score lines. Start, finish, start, finish, start, finish. And just to keep track of the ones I've done already, I typically go from right to left, verticals, and then I'll shift my paper and I'll do the same thing on the horizontals. And you want to make sure that you get them all, and you want to make sure that you're as accurate as possible where you're punching down through. All right. So with all of those marked, then I start trimming out the cut line that goes all the way around the template, the die line that you've created. And Depending on how thick your stock is how much effort you're going to have to put in cutting through your stock. Thinner stocks cut fairly easy. Thicker stocks, when you're working on corrugate, a lot of times you have to press down and be fairly firm with your knife cutting. And it always helps to have a sharp blade in place. So I'm going to start over on this side, and I'm going to start trimming out the perimeter of my die line. And one thing to remember in doing any of these steps is to be as accurate as you possibly can on your lines. The more accurate you are at hand trimming one of these out, the more accurate your die line testing is going to be. Because what you're basically doing is mimicking what eventually will be done mechanically when the package is printed. Curves, for the most part, I freehand, and it just takes a gentle pushing action to go around these curves. And I typically just start going all the way around. And when you cut, a lot of times on these outside lines, you can go beyond where your line actually is. That will help when you're eventually all done to punch it out, if you go a little bit beyond where your line is. Typically, you don't want to do that on any interior plane where it's going to show, but anything out beyond that you're going to scrap, it's okay to extend your knife cut beyond where you actually need to go. Corners, sometimes it typically helps to sort of thrust down in there on your knife and pull. That way you're sure your blade is getting down into that corner and not leaving a little piece of paper. One thing that's often missed is when you hit a corner like this, sometimes you forget that there's a line up here that you need to cut down, so just mind where you're cutting. Again, freehand curves for the most part, as long as you pull your knife gently around the curve, it typically does an okay job. I usually use short little bursts of pulls to get it to do what I want it to do. If during cutting you feel like your blade's getting dull and it's not cutting all the way through, it's okay to stop, change your blade, make sure you have a sharp blade in at all times. All right, and then you want to make sure that any interior windows or any interior cuts are done. Sometimes these cuts are quite small, but you should make them all. All right. So if you've done it correctly, what you should end up with, you can untape your template. You should end up with a piece that you can snap out of here fairly easily. Every now and then you'll get little hoochies here, but you can just trim them off. All right, so this is our flat version of the die line that you created. Now those tick marks that we initially created or ticked off in the very beginning, you can see on here where the starts and the stops are, and using a dull instrument that embosses the paper, you line your ruler up on those tick marks and pressing down quite heavily, you put your score marks in. Again, try to be as accurate as you can, because this is all those tolerances we were talking about in the beginning when you were creating your die line come into play on these folds. So being as accurate as possible when you do these scores are going to allow you to make sure that your tolerances are correct. It often helps to have your printed sheet up above, just in case you're not sure exactly what these tick marks mean. Sometimes it helps to have this. You can easily refer to it. So again, I'm going to continue scoring my tick marks. And if by chance, which often happens, you forget to put a tick mark on, you can easily just lay this back on here, line it up, and re-tick it where you need to go. All right, so what you'll end up with is basically a blank with trimmed all the way on the outside and scores where all your folds are. The next step is you can start creasing your package on those score marks that you just created. Flaps, flaps, flap. All right. So there's typically there'll be a glue flap of some sort on most of your packages. This is where the package glues together, and this will be mechanically done typically when the package prints. So in order to test to make sure that your package does fold up correctly and everything works and the flaps work, you'll want to follow through, and typically we use a piece of double stick tape, and we will put that double stick tape on that flap, trim away any excess. And what you should be able to do is you should be able to fold your package flat and join those together on that flap using that glue strip. And if you've done your die line correctly and it checks out, your box should fold, things should meet, should be tight. And if your product fits in there, you should be good to go. Every now and then, if your allowances are off and you need to adjust, you might have to go back and adjust certain allowances to get things to fit correctly, or oftentimes you might find that your package won't fold flat. Maybe one of these panels is off a little bit, or you weren't accurate when you did your die line. And that's what this will show you. If you're off, you'll be able to see it on here. And one thing to remember is if you do a die line for a specific weight of paper, typically can only be done on that weight of paper. Like I wouldn't be able to use this die line and trim it out of corrugate, because if I attempt to trim this out of corrugate with as thick as this corrugate is, you're going to run into issues on these flaps folding over, because corrugate's going to be a lot thicker than this, and you'll find you won't be able to fold this over. So that's what we do with most of our die lines. Again, start with an accurate die line, test it by trimming it out on the actual stock that you're going to use, and many times we go back to the drawing board, make tweaks until we get it perfect, until you know it's tight and it works on the stock. Oftentimes you might find that, hey, this is a little bit too flimsy for what I want to put in here. It's not the right weight. It feels too cheap or doesn't feel like it's heavy enough. Then you go back and, like I said before, there are many weights of paper available to make your package out of. Try it on a different weight or restructure your die line to work better. I hope this was helpful.